Sí, ya está grabando. Bueno, hola, oficialmente. So, the first thing that I want to say is that Pablo and I always thinking this project as a way to binding people in the region and to connect with people that we think our ideas and your ideas resonates with each other. So ways of working is the result of that. You know, how we can use the public program of the exhibition to start a long conversation that we really know that will catalyze other projects and other experiences between us. So this first talk with Tessa, Elisa, Bergel, Melo, Ramón, Miranda, Beltran, Sharelly, Emanuelson, and Cozier, you know, we'll go through your practices and your realities, and yeah, Pablo, if you want to.
Yeah, another thing is that, you know, we want to avoid, you know, kind of like an academic talk, or we just want to kind of like, you know, in first place, you know, to think of this as a first dialogue between us, and kind of like to think about our context. When we started the project and started talking to the artists, you know, we had a conversation with Chris on the phone, and he mentioned something that kind of like keeps repeating through the whole project. That is this idea of the Caribbean gaze, you know, kind of like looking at things from the Caribbean perspective, not necessarily doing works about the Caribbean, but from the Caribbean perspective. And you know, we would like for you, Chris, to kind of like start, you know, kind of like if you can go through that idea just a little bit, and then from there we can start a dialogue.
Well, okay. Well, I think, you know, the experience of the Caribbean does shape how people understand, how people from the Caribbean kind of look out at the world. I mean, we're not often asked to talk about that. We're often more asked to talk about our own internal conditions, right? As a form of entertainment or something, you know, within that sort of liberal gaze. But I think, you know, when you think of our histories in terms of plantation economy, slavery, things like indentureship, the various revolutions and so on, or upheavals, and the attempts at trying to make sense of sort of finding oneself in what I often call an industrial labor camp of Europe, that was once an industrial labor camp of Europe. And then when Europe left, we were told, you know, make a society out of this, you know. And so all of the different upheavals and revolutions and so on are attempts. And I think why with artists in particular, there's something that fascinates me as a person that grew up in the Caribbean, because when you look at artists, both from the other islands and those operating in the diaspora, what you start to feel is a kind of sense, I don't want to say historical narrative, but a sense-based kind of an attempt to grapple with the conditions of living in places like this and how you see the world. And I don't want to talk much more about it, but it's like little funny things. I mean, like I remember years ago, say when I used to spend a lot of time visiting Caracas, and somebody from Caracas looked at me and said, "Oh gosh, you guys from the Caribbean, you're always talking about colonialism and post-coloniality and this, that, and the other. But, you know, we became independent at the beginning of the 19th century. You know, we're way past that." And then in my mind, I kind of said, well, yes, but why it is all the darker people live in the favelas and all the fairer people live in Las Mercedes or La Florida. And, you know, I mean, it sounds impolite, you know, but it's a kind of truth about the world we find ourselves in. And it's playing out right now in the US, because In the US, you're kind of seeing whiteness being defined not so much as an ethnicity. It has really nothing to do with Europe. It has really to do with an entitlement to capital and to spaces to operate within a system and leaving others out. So, and in the Caribbean, where we are the majority population in our respective islands or in our worlds, the burden of responsibility to kind of take on these concerns often falls on us. And but not necessarily in a heavy didactic way. It just shapes the way we see the world. Why do I notice one thing and somebody else doesn't notice? And I think in the Afro-American world, they talk a lot about the privilege of not having to know. Well, unfortunately, we know too much. And so I think, should I just stop there and ask if this makes any sense? So, because I mean, I think when I look at work and when I travel in the region, what always strikes me is how similar the negotiations are with these concerns, even if they're not openly expressed, you know, in the work of many artists who come from, you know, the experience of growing up in a place like the Caribbean, because this is where it all started, you know, during the Enlightenment. You know, they came out here and they opened slave colonies. You know, it's crazy.
Yeah. So I'm thinking, you know, what you just said just made me think of something that has been around me more recently than before, and I think it's this. So I pretty much agree with everything what you're saying, Christopher. The only thing that I'm like, with this person that you encounter, this person was from Venezuela.
Yeah, just, you know, random people, friends. I used to spend a lot of time there in the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about modernism and how, like, the nation state, how that happened in America. And I think, I mean, especially with Haiti, the Caribbean has uh, like one of the first experience of a nation state. You know, it's the second nation state in the Americas, Haiti. Like the first revolution was the American Revolution, then Haiti, then like we have like all the other revolutions. So the conversation of modernism, or the way that the modern state, I think, brings all the Americas in a similar history, and dealing with uh, the way modernism, uh, I mean, modernism and capitalism uh, uh, deals with territory and deals with race, puts us pretty much everyone in the same bag. But I don't know. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, me or just anybody? No, I think, yeah, it's a strange situation, because when your modernism isn't necessarily my modernism. You know, I think you know, when modernism is discussed in the Caribbean, you think of chattel slavery and the plantation as a model of social organization. It's not something about technology and freedom. That's a mythology, you know. And yes, in the sense of Haiti, because at least there are four significant revolutions to some degree that maybe shape our social space, right? Which would be obviously the U.S., Haiti, and then you know, Venezuela, and then I suppose Mexico. But there are sort of upheavals in between, like sort of smaller slave rebellions, like the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica, and others in other places, you know, where different enslaved people, disenfranchised people kind of make a move on the system, um, or even through ritual, you know, and performance religion, and all kinds of things. So there's all kinds of processes that continue to unfold. Yeah.
I mean, Chris always makes a lot of sense when he talks, but I always want to add that I guess that's the Haitian in me, that there's nothing else for me except the Caribbean gaze. It could not be any different. Or I can even reduce it to a Haitian gaze if you want, because of course we're very proud of what happened in history, and understanding the world from the Haitian perspective comes first. Then through meeting various artists, meeting Chris, I kind of realized how parallel the trajectory of all the islands were, and despite big events or not. But I mean, all that being said, more than the gaze of the Caribbean towards the world is also how we deal with how we deal with the insertion, I guess, of this modernity you were talking, Ramón. But the new form or the infiltration of new ways, new thoughts that come through us, and how we turn inwards, I guess, or look to the past to be able to find the tools to deal with that, and keep to ourselves and find what is the best for us, I guess I'd say. That's always I think the position I try to put myself in, or how I try to orient my questions of where is the truth for me in this, where is the truth for us, and what is hidden behind certain notions of I don't know, of opening up the world, or all these kinds of new age ideas. I mean,
I'm also thinking like how, like, I guess I'm gonna talk a little bit about my experience, but maybe it relates to your experience too. But I mean, I think if you don't know anything about the history of the place that you're living, you still are informed by that history because it surrounds you. So either you're aware of it or you're not aware of it, it still influences you. So and I got to be an artist in Puerto Rico, and then because of the way that history is taught to us in school and university, there's a lot of things that are hidden that I'm now looking back and kind of like searching for them and learning them new. But so what I'm not sure, that maybe this is a part where I guess, like, I think having the experience of all of you can help, is that so how our day-to-day practice, what is the relationship that has with our history, I guess, even if we're not completely aware of it, like, has people had experiences where they like later realize that what they were doing relates to a larger history that they didn't know? Like, I think that happens with me, with like sometimes I'm choosing materials that are close to me, but then I realize there's a history to these materials. And then like I realize there's like historic connections after the fact of making the work. I don't know if any of you have similar experiences.
But do you mention it as an almost like intuition, or not necessarily?
I'm interested in how being in a place influence your doing and your thinking without you necessarily being lucid about it. Like I mean, I think like another example of this that I can think of is sometimes you're like in the countryside and you meet and talk with people that they seem to be like enlightened. They seem to have a really like good handle on their current situation, the situation that is like really near them, but they don't have a historic perspective. But that doesn't matter when you like find these people that are like really sharp and have an analysis of the situation. I wonder how these subjectivities construct, how they're constructed, I guess, like how the environment construct these subjectivities. I mean, does anyone has a similar? Am I the only one seeing this? Maybe it's not happening. I don't know.
It makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think a sense of what constitutes history is really rooted in how people tell stories about themselves. And, so it could come, like, I know there's been a lot written about dance and music, in which it's a kind of a memory, like a body language is a certain kind of dexterity may come from a certain history. So it's not about formal written history, but it may just come from the attitude of standing in a certain way, which comes from going through a number of experiences that we take for granted. So it's almost like a kind of archetypal thing, something archetypal, but it's coming through an experiential thing, so it makes perfect sense. Sometimes doing a gesture and then discovering why you did it afterwards is kind of what I'm thinking, and then you do the research and you kind of say, oh, okay, shucks.
And I think that could be, sorry, go for it.
No, go ahead.
No, dale.
Okay, no, I was thinking also about time, because we're talking about modernism and history, right? And when Ramón talks about people living in the countryside or living outside these failed modernist cities, right? But we all live in the capital, stuff like that. Time works in a different way, right? So we appreciate maybe, as Christopher said, the way we construct our identities when time is not at the service of capitalism, or that straight line is in a sense that we're expected to be on all the time. And you go back to a more cyclical and connection to nature, time changes, and in itself, identity changes too. Makes sense what I'm saying? It's been a long time since I speak English. I'm sorry.
God, I feel like I'm burdening everybody.
Not really.
No. So yeah, I was thinking about that, about time, about what the failure of time in this notion of modernism has done to us as artists, and how we think about it, how we relate to the city and how we relate to nature, and how this needs to also thinking about the way we see things, working from the Caribbean or coming from the Caribbean, how those things relate at the same time, and the time all the time, because I think time is a very funny thing, how it works in the Caribbean. I think it's different, and I think that shows in the work that we do also. Ahora tú, Pablo.
So I was also thinking about time, and then also about the different times, but then also kind of like, how do you narrate those differences? And then in a way, I always find that it's like Chris said at first, we've seen a lot of things, we've seen a lot. But then in a way, there's kind of like really basic expectations what we should be narrating. And I think all the artists that are here today talking, we pay a lot of attention on that, on working on different ways of narrating our experiences here in our region. And not necessarily to do it in a contested way, but kind of like just do it in a way like, this is what it is, And I think it proposes different ways of actually, we never explain things, but we kind of like present things to other people to kind of like think of it and kind of like to read it in a different way. And I think all the works in the exhibition that we organize and in our general practices share that. And I think it's interesting to kind of like finding, kind of like to think from those things that kind of like connects the works, instead of like, I think that kind of like open up the possibility of that, breaking that expectation of narratives,
Well, speaking as someone who got the chance to see the show, I could.
The only one.
I can tell you that when I walked in and when I did the round around all the and looked at the pieces, I felt that there was a lot of coherence between everything, or not that we're all saying the same thing, but there was a certain disregard for where it was happening in the work itself, although some of it was made for the space. I am thinking about the mural, for example, and it really felt like we were only concerned with each other and maybe Basel a little bit, and it felt good, I must say. And also that really you got to plunge directly into different cultures that of course are similar, but also into individuals that are doing their own researches and that can speak to all of us no matter where we are in the Caribbean. And that was really, I deplored the fact that I was not able to meet with everyone, at least those that could have made it, because I felt that this was only the start of the conversation. And so this opportunity to Zoom together is really great. But seeing the work, it's really, there's a really this common thread that comes in and out in all of I guess the aesthetics, but also the concerns of what we're looking for, or questions, or of the thinking. The Chris, you stuck this term of visual thinking also in my head, and since then I always use it. This visual thinking that's happening in the show, it's really quite fascinating.
Yeah. I really felt it for Yina and Pablo, because the one or two shows that I have done, there's something that always fascinates me, which is when the show is actually installed and you walk in it, there's suddenly you start seeing things as you move through that you cannot see if the work is not in each other's company, in each other's presence. So it becomes like a tertiary kind of something slightly dialogical, that happens just through the physical or actual experience of seeing and feeling the work. And so, we, even though you all have curated this project, you haven't really felt it, only at a distance, which is, so Tessa, you'll have to do you'll have to do some kind of embodiment through. She'll be a medium, yeah, and transfer sense-based resonances. It's been really challenging. I mean, it's challenging for me as well. I kind of made a silly joke. I think it was to Yina or somebody that like, oh my God, I hope this show doesn't just become another tiny little catalog sitting on my bookshelf, you know. But so I'm kind of glad we're having this conversation, and thank God for this kind of technology as well. I mean, we've had many, but this is great. You know, it
Yeah.
kind of it that little shiny thing that sticks off the bookshelf. It's like, you know, it's not so inanimate. You know?
No, if I speak for my experience, I think the fact that even the Dutch Caribbean is part of such exhibition is something, you know, that we've been not left out, or not, we've not been participating. And I think when I hear you guys speak, then I must think of time, but also size, because hearing things like countryside, you know, as an island, like we don't have countries yet, like even the sizes of the islands, Trinidad is so large. You know, I can't even begin to imagine Haiti. Chris, when you talk about the U.S. and the whiteness as an entitlement, you know, I still think, I mean, that happens to us on our islands in relation to the Dutch, you know, and how entitled they are in our spaces, and how that is very much present, and how the Caribbean gaze is exactly what you're mentioning. So this multiplicity, almost like like not for consciousness of it's like having this superpower of like being changing cultures and lenses. You know, you have like these triple gazes that you can see conversations happening. I think for me it happens, and when I'm in a space and I can see so many dynamics happening at the same time, and that I truly believe that is because I was born in the Caribbean and lived in here, that gave me that superpower actually. Because you know, immediately when certain clashes occurs or certain body languages are happening, and as I travel to the islands, I see similarity. I mean, without me knowing that. I think for me, this idea, like, also, but the same Caribbean gaze, as I'm saying that, I agree with you, Chris. I also think there's this existing gaze that is so neo-colonial almost, that kind of does not see Haiti as an example. Like for us, we look down to it. We look down to African, or we're not African, we're not Caribbean. We don't see that because of the also the time frame of when I speak to being the last, and not really being aware of what historically has shaped us and why, because of of course the huge amount of power that has and control that has been used through churches and through education. Um, so, I mean, and one large thing that is about that, I don't know if that also happens to you, or if that's also going on with you guys, is this huge, not lack, but not awareness of how much all the other Caribbean islands influenced and shaped us parallel to the European. So we're not only shaped by the Dutch very much. I noticed that, for instance, when I go to another country and I shake my hand, I reach out my hand. So my first initial way of communicating is not giving a hug or a kiss, that would usually be the case, but it would be a handshake, which is totally distant. And then I know, okay, that's my Dutchness performing right there. But also, I think the influence of the regional migration that has been taken place historically, but that is not being recognized as such. And there's also existing this case of being blind to ourselves, so the region, and just looking at the States and still looking at Europe as the meta, or as an example. So those are some of the things that came into my mind listening to all of you. I don't know if that resonates, or yeah. And Tessa, I'm really curious because you're also now in Holland, I believe, no? So
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
experiencing.
Well, right now I'm only experiencing 4 walls, to tell you the truth.
I was just thinking when you talk about migration too, you know, like I think one of the things that is still pending in terms of grasping something about this, you know, the Caribbean is a lot of the things we see, you know, movies, documentaries, books, they always talk about migration to Europe, migration to North America. But what's never really spoken about is the migration between islands, and which is
Exactly.
massive. And like, in other words, you can't talk about an island like Trinidad unless you talk about people that went to work in the Lago in Aruba, um, you know, the movement between us and Venezuela, particularly Sucre State, and then of course Caracas, and you know, and all the movements between, you know, Grenada, Antigua, St. Vincent, um, you know, and it's never really spoken of. There's only kind of one notion of migration, and people went all the way up to Cuba,
Mm-hmm.
and up, you know, Puerto Rico and different islands at different times in history for various reasons, you know, like the migrations to Panama and Costa Rica. And, but it's not really spoken of at all in terms of how, you know, like one of the things that blew my mind is that when I went, say, for example, when I went to Aruba and Curacao for the first time, and I heard somebody say Ayo, right? And we say Ayo when the thread in our kite pops and the kite disappears and over the horizon. Everybody stands and shouts Ayo when I was a little boy. And then I discovered that that's a way of saying goodbye in Aruba or Curacao, right? So, but we use it as a verb, like your kite has ayoed, right? And we also use words like caiman and stuff like that. And then you realize that there have been lots of migrations between Trinidad and Aruba and Curacao over the years, and it's because of oil predominantly, right? People working when Shell came into the Caribbean and the refineries and things like that. Thus, you know, in Aruba, there's St. Nicholas and places like that. And I discover things, you know, as I move around, I just discover all kinds of strange stuff, you know, like just last week, there was some weird thing, like when even Castro, when he went to visit after the revolution, landed in Trinidad and went and stayed with the Benedictine nuns, not monks, up, and nobody even knew he was in Trinidad at that time. And it's because it's the same. He went to some Catholic institution, and the priests knew each other, so he went and overnighted in a monastery in Trinidad on the way back from Latin America right after the revolution when he went on that tour. You know, it's just like every day you just hear something new, you know, that people are constantly on the move throughout the region. But then when we end up in projects, we get isolated again, either locally or in the interface. You know, we've been made back into local subjects. Yeah.
And exactly in my recent, so I'm busy now with a new body of work, and I'm following like this niche group, which is pretty large and is into comeback, which is basically Montuno and Bolero, and kind of how, and that came about because of Cuba, right? But how this, not only does we retract and it's not really spoken about, but it remains, I mean, the influence remains in this sort of dreamy state, or this state of celebration that is very unconscious, actually, almost, that like you said, through music to dance, that is mostly visible. It comes with the mannerisms of in those cases, but it's not from a very vividly awareness. And when you ask, and then some of them, I mean, some of my informants, when I have conversations with them, if I must have many questions for them to lead to the source, right? So there is indeed, it's very much not being spoken. Even I think when we hear when it's written or when we talk about it, it's either our influences are African, you know, it's like our African descent or European descent, and it's actually so much more than that. I remember the differences of being in Trinidad and the similarities with Suriname, for instance, in terms of the population, but how much how different it is actually when you are indeed in Aruba or when it's all mixed up, right? But how other things is how our carnivals we have been influencing each other so much. Trinidad as the mecca of the carnival, and how the calypso kind of totally came to Aruba because of it, because of its presence, indeed, because of the refinery. For me, I think there is much more to find, and in terms of there's a lot to learn as well in because Latin America, for instance, has such a rich history in defining something that of itself. So lo propio, you know, you guys say like, "¿Qué es lo propio?" To even bash it, to be able, we haven't had that, right? What is ours, or what can be defined? There was a small period, and we have one 30 de Mayo revolution, which is very small. Revolt that occurred, right? Compared to Haiti, compared to Trinidad. But yeah, so it is interesting conversation. So yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
Christopher, maybe I should have asked this at the beginning, but like, what do you mean by Caribbean case? Can you do like a cliff notes of the Caribbean case?
Well, sorry, there's all kinds of little critters running around in the yard. It's not so much a gaze. I think it's just something that comes from a certain experience, you know, a way of understanding the world. I mean, I think there's an interest, for example, like I was listening to us speak earlier, and I was thinking, like, when you ask yourself, what is the purpose of me being here, right? There's a thing called the Caribbean that's meaningful to people. It's an exchangeable thing. And we are often pressured to perform that thing, right? So we, in a sense, you know, if you understand something about how, like, we came into existence, you know, how we navigate space. So there's a sort of a way in which, how do you make yourself useful to yourself as opposed to others? And then useful to yourself in terms of others like yourself. Why are you sensitive to certain things that other people take for granted? Because you remember, like, you look at the United States situation, why it is that so many important characters, players in the American narrative around justice and equal rights come from the Caribbean. You know, that's something that people have never realized. Stokely Carmichael comes from Port of Spain, right? The guy, the other one, Farkan, comes from St. Kitts, right? And as you go through the civil rights movement, all these people, Shirley Chisholm grew up in Barbados and was sent home and came back, became like that important Black senator. So there's a kind of way as you narrate through even that, and what it is about the experience of these people growing up in a place like the Caribbean takes them to places like the United States, and decide that they're not going to take this shit and they're going to operate within that society in a certain way and make demands of it. Similarly, so in England. And then there's a number of people from the Caribbean that became very active in the early nascent moments of African liberation. They were close to the politicians, they were advisors, they were mentors, you know. So it meant that coming out of this particular circumstance, we sort of went, a certain generation, particularly the generation of the first half of the 20th century, went out into the world and kind of made demands on the sort of European mythology about liberation and freedom, right? So, I mean, that's kind of like our inheritance, how we understand, a way of understanding the world and understanding like why we exist, you know, because, and we're always in contention. I did this project years ago called Wrestling with the Image, in which I talked about shadow boxing with a doppelganger. The doppelganger is who we're supposed to be. Right? And there's lots of money, you know, for us to dance on that like a circus creature, stand on that little drum and dance, right? Because that's what people expect of the Caribbean. We're supposed to talk about certain things in certain ways. And then, but in a way we kind of dodged, you know, like I'm very fascinated about your clave project in a sense, you know, because it's talking about something very similar in terms of music. You know, in fact, I want to say as part of this project, I'd love to show that video in Port of Spain, you know, when we can have some kind of assembly again. I don't know if that, the way I kind of talked about it makes any sense, but.
Yeah, I mean, so when I haven't seen the show physically, but when I seen the videos and I have like look up more information, and so I think there's like maybe two things, and I guess this is a question for the curators. So there's what Christopher just said, and I think there's that in the work, in the show, where like this Caribbean artist looking in, and I think there's also a material connection, but I would like to know more like what Yina and Pablo thinks are that through line on the show. Like, do they see them? They see like a material connection and a kind of like content connection going together? Do you see it separately? I mean, what do you guys think?
Yo preferiría decirlo como una versión en español y que Pablo haga una versión en inglés. Bueno, por un lado está...
¿Y Pablo está de acuerdo con eso?
Supongo que sí.
No, pero yo creo que por un lado hay creo que realmente hay unos vínculos en como a qué le estamos prestando atención, que es algo que decían en algún momento de la conversación. Y me incluyo ahí no solo como pensando en artistas, sino también en trabajadores culturales de la región. Y justamente como creo que son contravisualidades, si lo vemos en términos técnicos, sobre qué se narra y desde dónde hablamos o desde dónde tenemos como permitido hablar o producir pensamiento, no solo en términos como del circuito artístico internacional, sino también dentro de las realidades de cada lugar del Caribe continental e insular. Y justamente como todos ustedes y todos nosotros estamos prestándole atención sobre todo al Caribe como un espacio de producción de sentido per se, que va mezclado a esa idea de la como mirada caribeña que menciona Cozier. Creo que no es algo fortuito en lo absoluto y responde justamente a ciertos contextos sociopolíticos que de una forma u otra nos han empujado o han facilitado el volver una mirada hacia adentro e intentar como Sí, académicamente dirían como construir una epistemología desde el contexto en el que se habita, tanto simbólico como material. Y yo creo que eso es como una cosa conductora en los proyectos. Algo que a mí me pareció muy interesante es la obra de Tony, que es el video que revisa unas cuestiones de la salsa en Puerto Rico, y la obra de Madeline Jiménez, con el mural penetrable. Hay unas frases que están en una canción de Aguanilé, y que también Madeline la trae como vista desde otra forma en su obra. Y para nada, o sea, Tony y Madeline no habían hablado al respecto, de hecho no han hablado más que por correa. Y eso justamente como de repente empezaron a aparecer esos como puntos resonando que sí, como retroalimentan la perspectiva desde la que abordamos el proyecto.
Ahora mi versión. Well, there's a couple of things. One, I want to start saying that, you know, although we have said before, and it's presented in different ways, it's tricky because this is an exhibition that it's an exhibition about contemporary art in the Caribbean, but we've been kind of like, you know, we don't have the tools to do a survey. So what we did was to work with a certain group of artists. You know, we cannot, you know, it's impossible, and it would be almost like an obscene statement to say that we're doing a survey about the whole region, because we left a lot of things out. But in a way, I think that, for example, what you were saying, Ramón, about almost that thing, you know, that you get, you know, you work with certain materials, and then suddenly those materials reveal to yourself, you know, I think there's a lot of similarities between that and what Sharelly was saying about her new project, about you know, bolero and music, you know, like suddenly it's like these things that kind of like shape a lot of our, de hecho, eso tiene que ver con lo que tú dijiste, Yina, de los sentidos, but, you know, things that kind of like start making sense through that relationship with objects and other things, you know, like music. But then also it's I think there's a relationship between, you know, to making sense and then also the senses. You know, there's also kind of like a, you know, almost like a radar in terms of that I think it's present in many of the works here, that kind of like put into that idea of that relationship of making sense, you know, kind of like imagine our region and then also narrating our region. You know, I think in Elisa's work that also super present, where there's a pretty explicit, but then also phantasmagorical exercise of kind of like reconfiguring the islands, you know? And I would say that those are kind of like the things that and then that's what we used to kind of like as a framing for that idea of ways of working in the Caribbean. Because it's also ways of inhabiting the Caribbean, ways of thinking the Caribbean, kind of like ways of narrating the Caribbean. And then also I wanted to add, you know, I don't know how long we should, you know, we can be here talking for hours, but there's also a thing that I think we all share, that it's this interest, although, you know, what Chris said about the migration between the islands and that being kind of like never been talked about. Also, in a way, the neoliberal Caribbean, that it's our current Caribbean, kind of like makes it really difficult for us to move around, you know. And I think that many of the artists in this exhibition, and also I can talk about Yina and I, we have an interest in kind of like being there, you know, like without thinking about scale, big scale, or anything, kind of like starting from one-on-one relationships with different artists in the region, and then also within the region. And I think we all have done different exercises, you know, the fact that Tessa knows Elisa, you know, Tessa, she's been in Dominican Republic, also we've been in Haiti, Yina, Ramón and I. Sharelly, she runs, you know, she's a part of a residency program that brings artists together. Christopher in Trinidad with Jan this year, and also with his practice. Well, Elisa, you know, you're not even from the Dominican Republic, so that's also, you know, you can, you know, can kind of like point there to, ¿Cómo fue?
And I got very excited when Christopher, I'm from Venezuela, and I got very excited when Christopher talked about Sucre State, because I grew up there.
Okay.
And yes, actually I did. So
Yes.
I think it points to the thing that you're saying, like immigration in also a mental and metaphysical way, you know, connections that are made beyond the body to converse.
Well, yeah, I think also one of the ways to grasp this whole encounter is the questions, the conversations we had in the beginning, which is, I see this very much as like an opening innings, so to speak. And how can we transmute some of these conversations back into the region in a way that it can mobilize further conversations? You know, like for example, Tony's video is an easy work that I know I don't have to ship anything, but it takes me back to something else that I was thinking of, which is in the beginning of my career, when I first came back into the Caribbean in the 90s, early 90s. I didn't have any money. I didn't have a dealer. I started getting into shows, and then the problems was no money to travel, no money to ship work, and so forth and so forth. And so that meant the scale of what I can do and the way I could participate in things like the Havana Biennial and so on affected. In my own practice, I started to work more conceptually because I was traveling a lot to Caracas then and looking at the work of things going on there. I realized, well, and technology was coming. So I started working more in video, more with wall transfers, working with cardboard, things that somebody could cut out in another location and assemble. And I find that, in a way, some of the early curatorial projects that we attempted at Alice Yard were things that did not involve the shipping, handling, all of the kinds of technological architecture infrastructures that impinge upon our abilities to kind of share work, move work around, and interface with each other. So I think it would be interesting as a group of people. Like I couldn't help but think of Tony's piece in Berlin. It never showed up, so he starts working with his pencil. Yeah, that could be as distinctively Caribbean, because you could have thrown a fit, thrown a tantrum, which I'm sure you did. But at the same time, the process of your inconvenience turns into a kind of a project, and that ability to adapt to circumstances, is kind of really fascinating. So for me, what's exciting about this moment is to what degree some of these projects in their current shape, or how can they be adapted that they could then be articulated back into the region in different parts of the region where people can accommodate them. So it's not about moving a big show, but maybe project one or gesture number two is appropriate for one location and not the other, to see what kind of discourses may manifest. That's a conversation we had at the beginning, I think, Yina, and we were trying to figure out, and Pablo. I think it'll be very exciting. So I hope the necessary forces are listening. But yeah, it'd be nice to kind of get one of these, because a couple of these projects to manifest themselves in different locations, because not everybody can accommodate everything, but one thing can go here, another can go there, or the artists themselves. And, and as time evolves, to keep the kind of conversation, dialogue, part of this project alive.
Yeah, this is... perdón, Ramón. No, that this, pero no te se te olvide. That also we've been thinking and discussing about, to kind of like, for us it's always, we ¿cómo se dice? We connect, we're together for the big event, when there's a big event, let's say, like you, Tessa, and Chris, and Tony, and you know, in Berlin, you know, that was a big meeting too. You know, that was a big event. You know, this exhibition, also COVID make it everything weird, but also it's a big event. But also we're working, and we wanna kind of like our long distance proposal is to kind of like find ways of this, you know, exactly what you're saying, Chris. Find ways of kind of like materializing gestures of this exhibition and our projects and the projects of other people too. You know, something that becomes more of a, you know, more of an everyday experience for us. You know, like, you know, not need to wait for, you know, to have you know, you, Chris, you know, when was the last time you were in Puerto Rico before, you know, your trip, you know, when your trip got short, like 10 years ago, right?
Well, that was the triennial in 2008.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
with Julieta Gonzalez. Yeah, Julieta brought me to do that project.
Yeah, so we need to kind of like find ways, and then also, you know, like you were there because of an event, you know, but also to think about ways of how we can, you know, it could be little or it could be huge, you know, but kind of like find ways for us to kind of like keep having these exchanges on an everyday level, you know, like kind of like our practices keep this, you know, like dialoguing.
Yeah, it's kind of nice meandering, you know, because I could tell you, I mean, apart from meeting Mishi a million years ago in Valencia, I thought about when I met Sophia in Costa Rica, and she had her project about the shadow. And right around the time I saw that project, I was talking to another person in Trinidad whose father was arrested. He was a member of the Jamaat al-Muslimin, which was the Islamic group that, you know, invaded the parliament in 1990. So she was developing a project about the women in the group and what happened to them because her father was arrested. A lot of the women, you know, were at risk when the government arrested them and so on. So I kind of said, okay, how do I get Sophia and her to talk? So that's actually the road, you know, it's kind of weird, you know, so then we raised some money, we brought Sophia there, that opened the conversation that we were trying to have with Beta Local, and then that led to us coming. And then, as you know, 2 other young artists from Trinidad came up to Puerto Rico for the moving thing, I forget what you call it, yeah? Alex Kelly and Luis Vasquez Laroche, right? So there's a kind of way where some of these informal things lead to something. It's not that we're just hanging out, you know? You know, that's kind of part of the thing. Oh, here comes my son. What does it mean? Does it mean I'm talking too long and I'm being missed? No. I'm in a meeting with these guys. What's up? What do you guys need?
Nothing. I just came to tell you good morning.
Oh, hi. Just woke up. All right, sorry. Good. I'll come and look for you guys in a bit. Yeah.
Ramón, ¿qué te iba a decir?
Yeah, today is his birthday. That's this sub story.
Happy birthday!
Congratulations.
Yeah, that's Tessa. Do you remember Tessa from Haiti? Oh, yeah.
You think?
Yeah, yes, I do remember Tessa from Haiti.
Cool. Because I've been following online.
Yeah. So
I'm wondering, I have a question, and maybe for Gina, also Pablo, but also you, Chris, because of course you've been here, you've been in the game for a while. When these big events, have been taken place, and we're talking about looking inwards, but also it's presented, in Basel, so the audience, the majority of the audience, what is the experience usually, when there is a particular effort, of bringing the narrative from our sides, so how would you think it's being perceived? This thing of over-explaining or having to explain even, and so is that also taking place, or has that changed for you, Chris, over the time? And Gina and Pablo, how are you guys experiencing it currently?
Who wants to go first?
Gina.
I think that to to make a dialogue, you need to have an idea or a little idea of the subject, of the message. And thinking on this context, you know, Switzerland, in Europe, and I think maybe the exhibition in Europe, it's more as an act of enunciado, como as an statement, and the dialogue is more difficult maybe to you really engage with the ideas that is, you know, putting in relation in the show. Yeah, because of that, I was thinking that how this kind of project, we have to deal with this, this is a statement in this context, and for many people, a dialogue too, but yeah, you really need a lot of effort to mediate the experience. And yeah, I don't know, I was thinking of that, but I don't have a really answer to how I think that the public in Switzerland perceive the show.
Pues yo no sé cómo contestar la pregunta. Because it's, in a way, I gotta say that, I don't know, for example, it's funny because I see Ramón and Tessa, and I think in a way, both your works, I think all the works, but both your works come from really specific, really concrete ideas that kind of like brings back to in a specific place, but none of them explain anything. You know, there's more of a way of being and kind of like of a way of understand, but they don't explain anything, and I love that. And
I think we have to blame Gabby.
I do, I absolutely do blame
I
Gabby.
don't mean that pejoratively. I mean, I think one of the best things that came out of the Berlin biennial experience, Elisa, you're talking about big events, but behind the big event is the presence of people like ourselves kind of moving, and one of the strangest things that came from Gabby in that event was this sense of not having to explain yourself, and sort of, because there's a way in which, and I kind of felt that actually beginning of the conversation, and I'm sorry, Tony, I was kind of ducking, because as we continue to talk, I found myself starting to sound like, oh God, I'm coming up with all these validations about history, and and I started hearing myself, and I started hearing the echo of my own voice, and I started to feel like, oh shit, man, I'm just in a lot, this is too stressful. I just wanna, if I was talking to you, if we were just hanging out, I mean, sorry to, I'll try, we would probably talk about different things, right? And if we were alone in the room, we'd talk about different things. So what is causing us to have to validate our very presence in space by saying that we are meaningful? Why do we have to reiterate the meaningfulness of the nature of our presence? And I think that it is true over the last couple of years, Caribbean art in general has become more visible in certain global platforms, but it's come with a pressure too, so I don't know if I'm getting anywhere close to what you were asking, Elisa, but I keep thinking, I don't really want to have to explain myself too much. I just want to do my thing. I mean, I don't mean this in an indulgent way. I'm because I've already outlined the space I'm coming from, which shapes the way I kind of see the world. But do I have to keep saying it over and over? Can I get to another level and another level of, in terms of the kind of value of my presence? Or do I always have to come back to because and why I'm talking about this is that the show in Switzerland, what's more important about the show? Is it that at that juncture of exchange, is it that becoming visible in Switzerland is meaningful for us? Or is it that what's meaningful for us is that we have to have this conversation, which then gives people in the context of Switzerland a global understanding, a kind of view of what's happening in the world outside of their immediate reality. You know, and that's a different way of understanding the value of our presence, because it's about them looking out
That has
and
to do
through us, you know.
that has to do a lot with the question we have in the chat about other structures beyond the exhibition.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it comes from the notion that when you exhibit in Europe or in the United States or institutions that are famous and are supposed to validate us, we now understand that we cannot dismantle these institutions because they're made from historically they're made from a racist standpoint. So we cannot pretend with our work just like dismantle these notions because the structures are made from that. So actually, I think it's very pertinent to have other strategies to, as you were saying, to come back and feed again these discussions that we're having without necessarily feeding into the structures that are supposed to be validating for us, you know, because they cannot be changed. They are what they are, you know. I think that's important.
Yeah, to follow up on that, and also maybe like my take on Ernesto's question, and thinking about ways of working in the Caribbean, I think syncretism is something that, I mean, we talked about it before. Christopher talked about it with the work of Tony, and the connections, the work of Tony. Gina talked about it with works from a syncretic practice that both works have. But syncretism, thing that it does very well is as a defensive mechanism, you get to reproduce and practice your culture, but in a way that on the outside, it doesn't look like you're practicing your culture. So I think when you are in kind of like the Western institutions, that's a time to have a defensive practice and to have a kind of like syncretic, to put syncretic work there, something that somebody from the outside will see it as one thing, but then it does something different for you, and it helps you think forward and advance, and maybe communicate with other people that talk the same language. So I think when we're like in Western institutions, we could do a syncretic practice that in a way is a way of that we can have our cake and eat it too, and then other ways of maybe like indirect and speculative actions that we can do is like is having our own practices in our places and having conversations with people from the region without letting the modern state borders predetermine with who we talk to. Yeah. I guess there's another question in the chat. Maybe somebody else wants to answer.
Please.
Oh, where's the chat? Oh, I was missing all of that. Could I put my glasses?
So I can read it. What is the idea of time behind the Caribbean gaze? How do you think that idea of time could shape our own idea of Caribbean contemporary?
I'm gonna let the Haitian answer that question for mischief's sake.
Wow.
Right. You know why?
Uh,
Or do I have to explain myself?
yeah, I think you do actually.
I was thinking a lot of Maxence, because that's something else I wanted to bring up. And it's related to Tessa as well. But, the thing, Maxence works with technology and he has this sense of there being in the technology, in the kind of world of the internet or or the web, in the digital world, a kind of alternate reality, a kind of course, in the construct of voodoo and so on. There's this sense that there's a world, a parallel world to the world that we live in, and I think in a lot of Maxence's work, he kind of almost manifests that kind of world within the digital space, but searching for something that that is kind of egalitarian and more ambivalent to the kind of strictures that are imposed upon us in the actual state or real world. So when I think of it in the context of time, then time has a completely different meaning in that other world. And I think a lot of the spiritual practices that exist in the Caribbean try to break us loose from conventional sense of time, space, everything, because, and I think in Tessa's work, what really fascinated me was the reconstruction, the kind of recreation of another self that kind of breaks down many of the traditional boundaries in the kind of reconstruction and the hybrid self that you have been in the process of either constructing yourself or trying to come to terms with as it is being constructed. So it brings up a really fascinating question, both in terms of your navigation of space as a Caribbean person, which is, I mean, what's weird about us as Caribbean people is that we entered this space as property, as I said in the text thing that I did for you, became subjects of different crowns and anything, and now we're trying to perhaps become citizens of new republics. That's, how many people on the planet have been through a transformation of being like that, from property to subjects of a crown to citizenship in such a short space of time, like what most of us have experienced in the Americas. And then as a spiritual subject as well, to reclaim one's, spiritual core in the process. So that, anyway, I'm stopped. You get the point.
Yeah. Well, I guess what I'd say about my view of time more and more is that, for example, I really am more and more detached from the idea of a contemporary Caribbean time or something of that nature. And I guess that's part of what's going on with the creation of this character and of inserting new narrative and history that's already been written, is that now is also part of now is also part of the construction of everything. And the Haitian Revolution for me is not something that's done and over with. It's something that still needs to be achieved in many ways, because it's always confronted to new challenges. So it's something that's always becoming, and so it's always becoming. Then there's never really a past, and the future it's all in the now. And so I find the idea of contemporary to be something that's highly divisive always, even if I'm thinking in terms of how they use the term of contemporary art and how it's a way of classification term that inside the artist community in Haiti, for example, has been very problematic. And so when I think about the work I did for the exhibition, I was really thinking about time as and trying to create an atmosphere that would be unidentifiable, that you don't know if it's the morning, if it's the afternoon. It's just some time that's always there. That is a little a step to the left, so in a parallel universe, if you want. But that's the thing in Haiti, and with spirituality and with magics, if you want, is that it's very real. You know, it's not just something that you believe it, it's there. It's not the magical realism, it's just reality. You know, it's and that's what I'm trying to finesse in the work.
Yo creo que también, maybe there's one last thing with the time thing. It's Ramón, you know, like the idea of hallucination that you suggest on your piece. You know, that it's hallucinating the future, but you know, like hallucinations always happen in the present. You know, and it's something that's only your you know, for example, in you know, like this is kind of like super obvious, but in some of the images of the piece that is in the exhibition, you know, you have you know, you're inside a cave. Then, you know, it's there, you have all the times, you know, kind of like all the, it's like a place that it's absurd, you know, you're absorbed in the present, but then you're like, you know, immersed in time, you know, in our geological time, you know, even the fact that many of the rocks that are on those, you know, it's actually rocks. It's not rocks. It's actually coral. You know, like you have the like, geological history there on, you know, almost like a snapshot.
And you have petroglyphs in some of the caves too, where like you have a whole society that was decimated that went to those caves. In the same wall where there's graffiti from 1950s to 2003 with aerosol or with Sharpie. Yeah, I mean, the cave is a strange space for time, to think about time. I mean, for me, it's a space to think about form. I'm trying to be in the cave to think, what should how my formal practice, to think about my formal practice, and because I think in the moment that we are now, we're in the middle of a shift, and I don't know how drastical the shift is, if we're like leaving modernism and going into something new, or if we're changing the way that modernism is imposed on the world. So I think it's for me at least, it's a time to look for a new materiality, new forms, thinking with the space that I am, and thinking with nature, and thinking the material as another. And then another that I cannot have a conversation with, that cannot understand me, but it has things that I can think with that object. And then, so the combination of me and the hints that the object gives will create an object that has input from me and the material that it comes to. But yeah, I don't know if it's, I guess the going to the cave is a way of like stopping time, go back to like start something new. That's what it does for me.
I just want to add that I always think the cave as the first space in the region where the syncretism start, you know, and and with the Haitian Revolution also start there. So I don't know, the cave is really important for the humanity and especially for us, I think.
And even I think it could, this idea that is somewhat universal, and thinking about the universal is like not a good place to start. But even though if the cave is a myth of the beginning, anyone that is like looking at it, thinking about like maybe the first shelter wasn't a cave. Maybe the first shelter was some type of wooden construction that there's no trace of it because it's wood, and there's there's no archaeological traces for it. Even if the cave is a myth for a beginning, I think walking in the cave and there's so many shifting grounds in the cave. Like there's sometimes where you don't know. I mean, you cannot know where it's up because gravity works in a way that you always know where it's up when you're like walking. But there's so many shifting floors, and the darkness. It is. I mean, I recommend it for anyone. If you want to like think with if you want like an environment that will take over. I guess it's the opposite of the sensory deprivation tank. Here you get like sensory overload instead of like getting sensory deprivation. Even though it's dark, you have your light and you can see. But it's a place to. I think it's a really good place to think.
I was thinking about that when you were talking about also when you go in the forest in the Amazon. It's like, it's another kind of unpredictable, you could step on a bunch of leaves and fall 100 feet, because solid ground disappears, like even in the mountains here in Trinidad, because, our climate is more Amazonian than it is sort of islandish. But if you go hiking in the forest there, you could literally walk off a cliff, but not even know, because the leaves sometimes get up to, you're walking leaves up, above your knees, and you and the trees and the cover of the trees makes it very dark. So you really are in a kind of nowhere space, and anything can happen. I don't know if, Tessa, did you hike when you were in Trinidad?
Oh no, city girl all the way.
Yeah, she was city, yeah. But people come and go walking in the forest a lot. And then when I worked with Marcel Pinas in Suriname, he took me into the interior a couple of times, which is kind of freaky. The Amazon is just scary. It's just absolutely scary. So it's another kind of notion of the cave, but and how people just can go and lie down out there, in the forest.
I have a question about syncretism. I'm like curious about what do you think? I mean, do you think that? I mean, do you think it's a good way of like thinking about art making now? Like, in a sense that we have to deal with kind of like a global or like the contemporary art gaze, I guess, if you think about it. So does like a syncretic practice, do you guys think it's useful to have, or do you think like it's also good to be like open about what we do in a way that anyone can understand it? And it's a question to anybody.
Well, right now I was just wondering about what difference you make between the syncretism and the process of creolization of things. Just wondering if there's a difference for you between the two.
I mean, when I think about it as syncretic, for me the main difference is that it comes from, it's like something that I will do to as a defensive mechanism, I guess, as a way of continuing a practice that is illegal or that is not sanctioned by an authority that controls what I'm doing. If it comes from the person that is practicing it, I think it's I call it syncretism. I think it's if it's I guess they're but I think also like the way that you can change language, it is a similar process too, but so I mean, I guess there are different creolization and syncretism, but like I guess I'm not that I haven't think about it in the way of language, because I think in Puerto Rico the Spanish was imposed, and kind of that's what stayed. We didn't create, even though a lot of people in Latin America and in Spain say that, you know, Puerto Ricans don't speak great Spanish, but I think there's not a process in which I mean we had like go farther in creolizing the Spanish language and have a type of a Spanish Creole. That would have been great, but I mean, what do you mean by creolization, Tessa?
Well, I was thinking about the concept itself, not really as restrained to language per se, you know, and trying to understand what you meant by syncretization. That's what I was trying to do. Understand how you understand syncretization.
Okay,
because,
but did you understand what I meant for syncretization with what I explained, or that didn't?
Well, I think I understand what you mean, and I'm trying to make it make sense for me. and so you were saying about some kind of a double grid of lecture, I guess, pertaining to something that's created and can be seen as maybe inoffensive in a certain light, but then is full of meaning for the person that created it, or that's.
I'm thinking of the Catholic saints. You know how the Catholic saints they have a Yoruba deity assigned to different Catholic saints, and it's a way where you could have your Catholic saints, and from a Spanish perspective, you're not.
Yeah. Of course, I understand that, but I mean, of course, the word is used a lot when it comes to voodoo. But of course, this can also be questioned, because if you're thinking about using, you know, if you're thinking that, I mean, I'm just making extrapolations, right? In the context of history, there's this gathering of people that come from so many different tribes that have their own beliefs, and that's creating this union, this unity, and they're putting their beliefs together. Then it makes total sense for me that besides the aspect of using the saints maybe as a way to hide what they're really doing, that they would really integrate the belief of the spirituality that there can exist also in the foreign and a white saint, if you want, you know. Just thinking that it becomes also a part of it, beyond just beyond just hiding behind it. You know, it has its own value, and being able to see how I make use of this, not just as a hiding tool, but for maybe the power that it has in itself. But I'm not trying to have a new thesis.
I'm listening, and I'm saying to myself, I want to argue with the notion of a defense mechanism. I actually feel that it's not a defense. It's actually just what it is.
Exactly.
And in the sense that the obsession with categorization and boundaries are kind of what our societies come in to have to contend with. So as an inherent strategy of being, we're always in the breach. So syncretism isn't so much, it isn't even a conscious act. It's about taking what's useful. And making connections, because, you know, like, for example, okay, there's an African European conversation in, say, in Haiti and in the North. But what I find interesting is that, like, in the context of Trinidad, where there's an Asian component, just as in Trinidad, we don't call the religion, it's called Shango, after one specific god, you know, and then the Indians, the Hindu Indians, that is, they favor Hanuman. Now, Hanuman walks around with a hammer and he gets over obstacles. So, you know, it's kind of interesting that people who are oppressed and have to rise over their circumstance lean towards hammer gods, you know? So you have, you know, so there's a kind of a weird way in which people use what's in front of them and they apply it to the circumstance that they're trying to overcome. You know, so whether it's a photo of St. George slaying the dragon, whether it's this, you know, it becomes really interesting. So I'm not sure if it's a defense mechanism in so much as it's just something about the nature of people taking what's useful to get on with their lives, so to speak. And I think that's kind of dangerous to some people, because they like boundaries, they like territories, you know. So that's why we become problematic, because I think there's something about that. The boundaries haven't served our interests.
I see, but like, how do you put that? I mean, this is too complicated. How do you put that in within the history of assimilation? So, I mean, we have been trying. I guess they have tried to civilize us, and in the process of civilization, assimilation is a really powerful tool. In that sense, then where do you put? How do you? I mean, do you think assimilation is right, or do you think it's something that we have to step away from? And then, like, how do we step away from?
Yeah, I think we take what's useful and we dump the rest. And I mean, I think that's a really important question about art, you know, and what's kind of interesting about the work we do. Because in a sense, a lot of us, at least in my situation, I studied in normal art colleges in the US, you know, but when I came back into the Caribbean and then started traveling in the region, I realized that there's a funny line by Derek Walcott in one of his essays where he says, if you want to enslave a people, you serve them a dead God, right? You know, and there's a kind of way in which all these theories and in the whole way in which contemporary or towards modernism towards contemporary is taught in the institutions in the US. It's about them trying to break out of their own traditions, but then they're kind of selling it to us. But they're measuring us by those rules. But we were out, we were never in there to begin with. You know, so there's a kind of way in which if we just get on with the business of doing what we do in the way that we do it, then we have nothing to shed, you know, because, you know, we're taking on things, you know, that they're like burdens, you know, if you see what I'm saying. You know, like if you listen to I'm going to get very simple about it. The conversations around twerking are, you know, are the most ridiculous conversations when you read American media about twerking, right? They even came up with a word for it. Just in terms of how people coming out to the African, Caribbean, Latin American diaspora move their bodies from childhood. You know, like when did it become something? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But when they turn it into something that has to be contended with, and bring up issues of morality and sexual things, and no, but you just put on rhythm here in Trinidad, and a 6-year-old child, you know, will make your grandmother blush, right? You know, I mean, there's a line in one of the songs here where the guy says, when the woman started to move her hips, she looked like she never had been christened, right? I mean, that's a bizarre line, right? And he's talking about an 80-year-old woman. He's not talking about a young woman, right? You know, when the music came on, the 80-year-old woman started to move her hips like she had never been christened, right? So, I mean, these are concepts. I mean, I'm sorry to use such a simple definition, but it starts to talk about something inherent in about our experience. And then we get educated, allegedly, as you say, civilized, into burdens. And then we have to find our way back out, you know, or back around. It's an ongoing, there's no answer to it, I think. It's the very nature of our existence. And it's a conversation that we can have here on our own that can go on and on and on. And then we only have to deal with what we should be or what is or shouldn't be when we at that juncture of exchange. When people start saying this is what art is, and therefore what we are doing is not art. And so on, you know, those kinds of conversations. I mean, I had those conversations when I went up to art school in the 80s, you know, because art was something that 45-year-old white males did up in Boston or something, you know, around New York. But I think we're way past that moment now. You know, there's a whole planet out there now. Yeah. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense. You know, I don't think there's a fixed answer to the question is what I'm saying.
Well, it seems to me that the answer was avoiding categorization, but I don't know.
I guess we should have a license to irreverence.
Yeah, the language of categorization is the politics and the language of categorization is what I think we kind of, from a Caribbean perspective, we have to contend with. We have to reject because it's never served us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I don't agree.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
but it's fine.
Something I'm trying to make sense of myself.
No, I mean, and I am trying to make sense of myself too.
Yep, join the club.
I think, yeah, everybody tries to make sense of themselves. Yes, you have to do that and make sense of the place that you are at the same time.
Yeah, that's why I kind of got, you know, I understand what you meant by defense, but I felt you could be more mischievous and see it as more an offensive act in both senses of the word offense. Which
yeah, I mean, but a place that I wanted to go with that was that I was thinking that in the contemporary time, you know, the offensive and the defensive, in a way, I think in culture, this is, it sounds that I'm talking about everyone, but really I'm just talking about, I'm trying to make sense of myself.
Mm-hmm.
But what it seems to me is that the space for offense and the space for defense in a like military sense of the way, for me, has have shifted. Where like in my country, that is the space of offense, and when I'm outside of my country, it's a space of defense.
Mm.
And that's you know, it's like opposite of how you think about a meet in the sense of a military sense. But I think in the culture field, I think it works that way. Like for me, I have to be offensive in the literal and in the and in the poetic sense of the word. When an artist that is not from Puerto Rico comes to Puerto Rico with like a funded project to make work of Puerto Rico that will be seen outside of Puerto Rico, that will put a chill and will make you know, my work invisible, because somebody from the metropolis is taking Puerto Rico as a subject. I think, I mean, I don't know how this type of situation happened with when Peter Doig moved to I don't know if it was something similar, but I see it here. I see it in Puerto Rico, where like somebody from the States funded, makes research, then shows, like I'm applying to the same grants that these people are applying, but I don't get them. You know, they get them to make work in Puerto Rico.
I could say something else. I mean that even without getting into the internal politics of those questions, which are tropes now, I think, in terms of Caribbean experience. He won't be the first, you know, and they won't be the last. But there's something inherently Caribbean about that. Remember, the first smart man was Columbus. Huh? You know, he found the islands, and he drew tigers and lions on the map and elephants and shit, so he could get more money back in Spain to get a next expedition to come back. We in the Caribbean understand that. You know, it happens on the beach every day, you know, where the tourist is lying on the towel and the guy comes with a briefcase to sell them shells. You know, it's a kind of an exchange. And people assume in that exchange that we are the weaker party. But maybe that's another kind of Caribbean theater. And the rest of us that don't have to play it just shrug and say, well, boy, I like your hustle, proceed, but I don't feel I want to do it. You know, so I kind of think, you know, it's such a complex space, the Caribbean has so many psychic spaces. But that game you're talking about continues. It's something so essentially Caribbean that we have to talk about it as a Caribbean criteria in itself. you know, if this is doing now, next week it'll be somebody. It was somebody. I mean, look at what happened in Haiti. You know, Andre Beto and W. Du Bois went down there, and one could say that they went after the Sang Solil and all these guys, you know, and aggrandized them almost in the same way that the American State Department grabbed Duvalier out of the bush, you know, kind of half-assed vet, and set the country in a whole thing. That was a kind of Western event, you know, between the arrival of Breton and Dubois were kind of part of a conversation around negritude and the fantastic that Europe and US were involved in. And they kind of embodied these people they found in Haiti in that narrative. And that narrative is still kind of going on, right? But the Haitians benefited. They got money, they got fame, they got, you know, and there's a whole industry of that kind of art. But there's other art happening in Haiti, just as significant, right? We're kind of talking to one of them right now. But the thing about it is, that's the game, yeah? It's kind of like a game, if you see what I'm saying. And it's so Caribbean that we can't even see it anymore. It's so close to us. It's happening all around us all the time. There's a great play by Derek Walcott called Pantomime. Small kind of 1 or 2 act play. I saw it when I was a kid. It's just a guy under an umbrella being served by a waiter. but it kind of plays around with Crusoe and Caliban, you know, and it's crazy, that relationship. You know, the guy's bringing him cocktails and you're kind of wondering who has the power, really. You know, the guy sitting down under the umbrella or the guy, you know, bringing the drinks.
Yeah, I mean, with Caliban.
Yeah.
With Caliban
and Prospero, yeah, well, that kind, you know, it's just an ongoing story.
Yeah.
Sharelly and Elisa, do you want to add something?
Yeah.
Not really. I think it was talked about very well, actually, and it was interesting to see both of them coming together into the same idea and understanding that there's all strategies all the time, trying to survive and trying to understand what happens. You know, we're always trying to survive and understand as artists. Exactly, distance, offense, everything.
No, for me, it's indeed interesting to listen to. I have to say, Chris, oftentimes I agree with you, so I just shut up and listen. I mean, and learn, no? But what I have to say in terms indeed of the categorizations, I think it's, at least for me, I'm trying to rediscover or discover, and indeed, like who has the power? How do I look at myself and my own society? And therefore, I have to. There's so many perspectives that you can look at it, and so that everything I have been taught, I have to leave out the window. So because otherwise, I will be blinded. I will remain blind. So it's not. I oftentimes, because I'm working with film and the image, and then it's oftentimes, you know, we're not being seen, we need to have a voice. So then I think of like, okay, but are we not being seen, or is the person blind? You know, this idea of adhering to a particular category or having to bring a particular statement. So nah, I don't have anything to add at this moment. Just, I think it's amazing to hear, and it just makes me think in my process of when you give a tangible example of the play. I think of this infrastructure, the Caribbean infrastructure, for instance, like you have to take a half of day off work to go to the bank, or to go to stand in line, or you know, you can't do that. These systems, infrastructures that we have in the Caribbean still to this day, which in the first world countries, so to speak, you don't have. It's impossible to think that you're taking a day off because you can do everything online, or you know, you can think of it as being. I was thought you can look at it as a way of deficiency of not, but it also has a purpose, and you can also redivert the side or way of thinking and looking at it. So yeah. The crickets, you.
Didi.
¿Ah?
¿Qué ibas a decir? Continúa.
No, I was starting to hear the crickets of the garden of Chris. No?
Hi, crickets. And it's kind of, the sun is going down, it's gone over the hill, so they're gonna start getting noisy.
Bueno, pues igual los crickets están diciendo que ya deberíamos concluir.
Yeah, and maybe for the next conversation with Tony, Madeline, Morvan, Nelson, maybe we can start the conversation with this subject and then switch by email or another Zoom. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice if you guys send us the recordings of the next one.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, y si quieren participar, pueden infiltrarse y chatear y mandar todas las preguntas que quieran.
I think I'll do that. At least let me know the link.
So it's next week, same time as this one. I think we can wrap up, but do you want to add anything else for the conversation?
Let's hope there'll be lots more.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we'll find ways of keep working together.
Chris, do you have, sorry, Chris, do you think there is hope? Because we always, has that been increased? I mean, for you, this is another opportunity, like, is it feasible? I go back to you because there have been attempts, no? Where do you think the pitfalls are in terms of staying in dialogue, or where?
I just think this is a really difficult time because I know when the COVID lockdown started, I thought, well, nobody knew how long it would go. And I remember in the beginning, I said to myself, this is going to be great. I'm just going to lock off. There's some writing I want to do. There's something I want to develop. And then after about 2-3 weeks, if I can't even think. And I must say, I mean, like, I haven't been able to work properly. I'm just barely working. I have to really force myself to read. This is now, you know, like I've really just fallen off the edge of the planet, right? And in the beginning, there were lots of invitations to be on Zoom panels. And I got very angry. And I said I didn't want to be on any. I was on one at the very beginning with Sharelly. And when I sat down and listened to it after, I felt I sounded so angry and grumpy and frustrated. And I said, I'm not going to appear on anything like this again. And in fact, I almost didn't even want to do this, but because I just feel like the psychology, but I'm also climbing out of it. No, I'm kind of settling down, but I was a mess. I don't know about you guys, but I've been a mess. I mean, I started planting flowers. If you want to see, I can show you my flowers. I have flowers. I've planted pumpkins.
I want to see them. I want to see.
All right, I'll show you my damn flowers. Can you see it?
Yeah, wow.
Flowers. Pumpkins. Flowers. Okay. I mean, I am working, but it's crazy.
Maybe as an exercise we can give tours, like, so instead of Zoom talks and lectures, we can just walk through town on each country and just
it was a way, I mean, but as I said, I'm glad we had this conversation because at least I got to connect with people that I've not really had a chance, Elisa, Ramón, so it's kind of cool, I'm overdue to talk to Sharelly. Sharelly, just look for me in the morning.
Okay. Morning hours.
Okay, we know that.
Yeah.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Really wonderful to, catch up. Yeah. Pablo, Yina.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Nice to meet.
Yeah.
Hasta pronto.